Today, I'm sharing 20 of these extraordinary church cookbook recipes that sustained a generation through America's greatest financial crisis, and why they're suddenly relevant again in today's economy. Number 1. Poor man's steak. Imagine feeding 6 hungry mouths with just 1 pound of ground beef during America's worst economic crisis. When meat became a luxury few could afford, families faced a difficult challenge: how to provide the protein their growing children and hardworking adults desperately needed without breaking their already strained budgets. Enter the ingenious creation known as poor man's steak. Church women across America discovered that by mixing scarce ground beef with readily available fillers like cracker crumbs, oatmeal, or breadcrumbs, they could stretch a single pound of meat to feed an entire family. The First Baptist Church of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, published a particularly popular version in their 1933 community cookbook, instructing cooks to combine 1 pound of ground beef with 2 cups of cracker meal, 1 egg, and enough milk to bind. Form into oval patties resembling small steaks, brown in a skillet, then simmer in gravy until tender. Number 2. Potato soup. If stretching meat was an art form, then transforming potatoes into sustenance was nothing short of magic. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the humble potato emerged as America's unsung hero. Cheap enough for empty pockets, yet substantial enough to keep families from the edge of starvation. The statistics were grim, with unemployment hitting 25% and over 9,000 banks failing between 1930 and 1933. Many Americans who'd never worried about food suddenly found themselves standing in bread lines. That's when church kitchens became salvation centers, with massive pots of potato soup bubbling away in parish halls across the country. The Methodist Women's Auxiliary in rural Minnesota published what became a lifeline recipe in their 1932 community cookbook, boldly declaring that a pot of potato soup can feed 12 hungry souls for less than $1. This wasn't just thrifty cooking, it was economic survival. What made Depression-era potato soup truly remarkable was its ingenious flexibility. Nothing went to waste. Families carefully scrubbed potato peels rather than discarding them, adding both nutrition and substance to the broth. When milk became an unaffordable luxury, creative cooks used the water from boiling ham bones instead, adding a hint of smoky flavor along with precious protein. Number 3. Water pie. Those empty wallets that couldn't afford vegetables certainly couldn't stretch to luxuries like dessert ingredients. Yet in church kitchens across America, a culinary miracle was taking place that defied all baking logic. Water pie sounds impossible, a dessert where the main filling ingredient is literally just water. But this ingenious creation became the showstopper at Depression-era church bake sales. Back in 1931, the ladies of First Presbyterian Church in Memphis documented one of the earliest versions in their fundraising cookbook. The recipe was brilliantly simple. Pour water into a pie crust, sprinkle with sugar and flour, dot with butter, add a splash of vanilla, and something magical happened in the oven. The ingredients transformed into a silky, custard-like filling with a delicate sweetness that seemed to materialize from practically nothing. Church gatherings throughout the 1930s regularly featured these remarkable pies. One Oklahoma minister's wife became something of a local legend for bringing 6 water pies to every church function, feeding dozens of parishioners for mere pennies per slice. The subtle sweetness and surprising texture delighted Depression-era diners who had little access to fancy desserts. Number 4. Dandelion Salad. The humble dandelion, that bright yellow weed you've probably spent hours trying to eliminate from your yard. Turns out, it was once considered a prized ingredient rather than a nuisance. When grocery stores emptied and fresh vegetables became scarce luxuries, Americans rediscovered what their ancestors had known for centuries. Food was growing freely right under their feet. Spring brought particular challenges during the Depression. Winter stores had dwindled and gardens weren't yet producing. This created a dangerous nutrition gap, especially for growing children who needed vitamins to develop properly. The solution was literally sprouting across America's lawns. Number 5. Vinegar Pie. When orchards became as barren as bank accounts, Depression-era bakers turned to an ingredient so unexpected, most modern Americans would consider it culinary madness. What common pantry staple could possibly mimic the bright, tangy flavor of fresh fruit when there wasn't an apple or berry to be found for hundreds of miles? The answer was sitting right in most kitchen cabinets: vinegar. The First Methodist Church of Springfield, Illinois preserved this clever solution in their 1930 community cookbook, describing vinegar pie as a pie for when the apple barrel is empty. This wasn't just a cute description. It was the harsh reality most families faced. Number 6. Hoover Street. Church desserts might sustain the spirit, but when families faced actual starvation, they needed something more filling in their bowls. Ever wonder how a single pot of stew with just hot dogs and macaroni managed to feed over 300 people at once? The answer reveals how close America truly came to mass starvation. Named after the man many Americans blame for their suffering, Hoover Stew became an ironic lifeline in church soup kitchens nationwide. The Salvation Army developed one of the most widespread versions around 1932, creating a recipe that could stretch minimal ingredients to maximum effect. By slicing hot dogs paper thin, combining them with macaroni, canned tomatoes, and any available vegetables, these kitchens produced enormous quantities of nourishing food at minimal cost. Number 7. Wacky Cake. While Hoover Stew kept hunger at bay, what about those special celebrations that make life worth living? Birthdays don't pause for economic disasters, but how do you bake a cake when eggs, milk, and butter were completely out of reach for most families? Enter Wacky Cake, a Depression-era miracle that solved this heartbreaking dilemma. In 1933, the Women's Auxiliary of Grace Episcopal Church in Cleveland published one of the first documented recipes for this unusual dessert in their fundraising cookbook. Their ingenious solution? Replaced traditional ingredients with pantry staples, vinegar and baking soda for leavening, creating a chemical reaction that made the cake rise, and vegetable oil instead of butter. Number 8. Ham and bean soup. While Wacky Cake solved the dessert dilemma, families still faced a more critical shortage: protein. Ever wonder how desperate mothers managed to put meat on the table when there simply wasn't enough to go around? The answer lies in a simmering pot of ham and bean soup that turned a single ham bone into a meal that could nourish 20 people at once. When meat became a luxury few could afford, church kitchens across America transformed into protein multiplication centers. In 1931, the Ladies' Aid Society of the First Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri, shared their miraculous solution in their community cookbook, explaining that a single ham bone with a little meat still clinging to it can flavor enough soup to serve 20 hungry souls. Number 9. Peanut butter bread. While ham and beans solved the dinner dilemma, breakfast and lunch presented an entirely different challenge. Imagine trying to bake bread, the foundation of nearly every meal. When yeast became as rare as gold dust and milk was a luxury few could afford. The solution? A revolutionary peanut butter loaf that transformed humble pantry staples into protein-packed sustenance. This brilliant innovation first appeared in the 1932 Five Roses Flour Cookbook, but gained momentum through church recipe exchanges. The First Presbyterian Women's Circle of Des Moines created a version they specifically noted was especially good for growing children's lunch pails. Their timing couldn't have been better as school nutrition became a growing concern for parents stretching every penny. What made this bread remarkable was its simplicity: just flour, baking powder, salt, sugar, peanut butter, and water, substituted when milk wasn't available. No yeast required, no eggs needed, no butter necessary. The dense, slightly sweet loaf became a fixture in community food assistance programs, regularly included in charity food baskets distributed to struggling families. Number 10. Church supper casserole. Did you know that individual families weren't the only ones scraping by during the Depression? Churches across America faced an even bigger challenge: feeding entire communities when the collection plate held more IOUs than coins. This crisis sparked an ingenious community feeding system centered around a single, adaptable recipe. In 1934, the Women's Missionary Union of First Baptist Church in Oklahoma City developed what would become a Depression-era legend. Their creation, a flexible casserole combining cooked macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever protein was available, spread throughout the Southern Baptist Convention like wildfire. What made this dish revolutionary wasn't just its ingredients, but its adaptability. Church kitchens received unpredictable donations each week. A handful of carrots here, a few potatoes there, maybe some beans or a small portion of ground meat if they were lucky. The beauty of church supper casserole was its ability to incorporate literally anything. Topped with breadcrumbs mixed with a bit of saved bacon grease, these communal dishes transformed random ingredients into meals substantial enough to keep both bodies and spirits alive. Number 11. Egg drop soup. Ever wonder how families who kept chickens could make just a few eggs feed everyone when money was tight? While church communities gathered for massive casserole meals, at home, rural families were mastering the art of stretching their precious protein sources through clever cooking techniques. When winter slowed egg production, families turned to an ingenious solution that came from an unlikely cultural exchange. The Women's Guild of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Chicago adapted egg drop soup from Chinese traditions, creating a Depression-era version that required just chicken broth, often made from salvaged bones, a couple of eggs, and perhaps a sprinkle of green onions or a bit of cornstarch for thickening. Number 12. Tomato soup cake. Speaking of ingenious substitutions, tomato soup wasn't just for lunch during the Depression. How did a can of Campbell's transform from a simple soup into what church cookbooks called the miracle cake? The secret recipe fooled even the most discerning taste buds and turned something ordinary into a celebration. When fresh fruit became an unattainable luxury for cake making, Depression-era bakers needed to get creative. The Methodist Women's Circle of Lansing, Michigan stepped up to the challenge in 1936, publishing a cake recipe with an ingredient so unexpected that they proudly claimed it was impossible to detect the secret ingredient in their community cookbook. This culinary sleight of hand combined a standard can of tomato soup with basic pantry staples: flour, sugar, lard or vegetable oil, warm spices like cinnamon and cloves, and baking soda. The acid in the tomato soup activated the baking soda, creating a perfectly risen, moist spice cake without expensive ingredients like fresh fruit, eggs, or milk. Number 13. Creamed chipped beef on toast. While Campbell's soup was transforming dessert tables across America, hungry workers were lining up for another surprising dish at church breakfasts. If you've ever heard military veterans mention a meal with a colorful, impolite nickname that involves toast, you already know we're talking about creamed chipped beef, a protein powerhouse that gained civilian popularity during the hardest years of the Depression. When affordable meat disappeared from family tables, the Lutheran Aid Society of Milwaukee recognized a solution. Their 1934 community cookbook praised this simple dish as satisfying fare for hungry families that stretched minimal ingredients to maximum effect. The genius was in its simplicity. Paper-thin slices of dried beef, first rinsed to cut the saltiness, swimming in a basic white sauce made from flour, fat, and milk, all ladled over homemade toast. Number 14. Corn chowder. While dried beef kept breakfast tables filled, dinner presented an entirely different challenge as winter months dragged on. When freezing temperatures settled over America's farmland, a simple soup emerged from church cookbooks that transformed summer's preserved bounty into winter salvation. This wasn't just another recipe. It was the difference between hunger and hope for countless rural families. Corn chowder became a staple of church suppers during the Depression, especially in rural communities where families had carefully preserved their summer harvest. The Women's Fellowship of the Congregational Church in rural Iowa recognized its importance, noting in their 1933 publication that a little salt pork and some corn can warm both body and spirit in winter's darkest days. Number 15. Bread pudding. Those communal meals often ended with a humble dessert that performed a near miracle in Depression kitchens. While families received day-old bread from church relief programs, they needed a way to transform this charity into something that felt like a treat. Bread pudding stepped in as the ultimate zero-waste solution, turning what many would consider garbage into a dessert so beloved that it appeared in the finest cookbooks of the era. The Episcopal Church Women of Christ Church in Alexandria captured this perfectly in their 1932 community cookbook, describing bread pudding as the alchemy that turns yesterday's bread into today's comfort. This wasn't just poetic language, it was practical magic happening in kitchens across America. Number 16. Chow Relish. Those raisins in bread pudding were rare luxuries, but the real treasure of Depression cooking came straight from backyard gardens. Did you know that a single jar sitting on most Depression-era pantry shelves could mean the difference between bland subsistence and a meal worth savoring through the darkest months of winter? Chow Relish became the secret weapon that transformed monotonous plates of beans and cornbread into something you'd actually look forward to eating. When summer gardens exploded with produce, smart families knew they couldn't let a single cucumber or green tomato go to waste. The First Baptist Church of Charlotte's 1935 community cookbook showcased a particularly popular version that combined cabbage, green tomatoes, onions, peppers, and cucumbers in a vibrant vinegar bath seasoned with mustard seeds and turmeric. What made Chow truly special wasn't just its practical preservation value, it was how these community canning events brought women together. Church kitchens became bustling hubs where dozens of hands chopped vegetables while sharing both recipes and local news. These gatherings transformed the labor-intensive process of food preservation into social events with purpose. Number 17. Cabbage with hot bacon dressing. If Chow was the preservation champion, cabbage was the fresh vegetable heavyweight of the Depression. But here's the strange contradiction that helped families survive. The most affordable vegetable was often paired with one of the most expensive ingredients of the time. A mere teaspoon of this prized addition could transform the humblest head of cabbage into something church potlucks celebrated from Pennsylvania to the Midwest. German Lutheran communities knew exactly how to make cabbage sing. In 1933, St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne published what became one of the most copied recipes of the era. A simple preparation that turned ordinary cabbage into something families actually looked forward to eating 3 times a week. The magic happened just before serving, when hot bacon dressing brought raw cabbage to life. Number 18. Milk toast. When families were down to their last few pennies during the Great Depression, a humble dish emerged that represented the absolute floor of culinary possibility, yet somehow managed to provide real comfort. Milk toast stood as perhaps the simplest recipe imaginable, requiring just 2 ingredients that remained accessible when almost everything else disappeared from American pantries. Unlike the elaborate preservation techniques and clever substitutions we've explored, milk toast asked nothing of its maker beyond the most basic cooking skills. The dish gained legitimacy when the Women's Christian Temperance Union documented it in their 1931 household guide with the powerful assertion that it sustains body and spirit when nothing else can be afforded. Number 19. Potato pancakes. The secret to surviving on potatoes day after day wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was about tricking the mind into believing you weren't eating potatoes again. When German-American church women shared their crispy potato pancake recipe in 1934, they were delivering psychological salvation from the despair of dietary monotony. The Ladies' Aid Society of St. John's Lutheran Church in Wisconsin discovered what seemed like mathematical magic. 3 potatoes could become a complete meal for 4 hungry people. Their European-inspired solution transformed the humble spud through texture rather than adding expensive ingredients. Number 20. Mock apple pie. Speaking of creative food substitutions, the Depression-era mock apple pie takes kitchen ingenuity to an entirely different level. Would you believe that churchwomen in Kansas created a pie so convincing that people couldn't tell it contained 0 apples? This wasn't just a recipe. It was an act of cultural preservation disguised as dessert. The Presbyterian Women's Circle of Topeka published their ingenious creation in 1932, boldly claiming that none will guess the secret ingredient. That mystery component? Ordinary Ritz crackers. When soaked in a special syrup of sugar, water, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, these crackers underwent a miraculous transformation. The chemistry behind this culinary magic trick produced a fill-in with an apple-like texture and flavor that fooled even the most discerning taste buds.